What's the weirdest anomaly that exists or has ever existed? Story 1. In Wexford, Ireland, there's an old man in a pub that everyone knows is a fisherman. My uncles remember him being an old fisherman in the pub when they were children. No one has ever seen him on a boat. He has always been the old fisherman in the bar as long as anyone can remember. Near as we know, he's fecking Peter the disciple. Story 2. There's a place in Venezuela, over Lake Maracaibo, where the sky basically turns into a strobe light for most of the year. It's called Catatumbo lightning, but people also call it the Lighthouse of Maracaibo, because sailors used to navigate by it. And that nickname isn't poetic exaggeration. Lightning strikes there so consistently that the horizon just flickers. We're talking lightning on something like 200 plus nights a year. Storms that can last up to 10 hours in a single night. At peak intensity, you can get hundreds of strikes per hour. Imagine standing there, and the sky is just constantly flashing. Not a quick thunderstorm rolling through, but a sustained electrical barrage that keeps going like the atmosphere is short-circuiting. What makes it weirder is that it's geographically locked in. It's not random. Warm air rises off the lake, cooler air comes down from the Andes. Everything collides in this perfect storm factory right over the delta. It's like the planet accidentally installed a permanent lightning generator. And the apocalyptic vibe is real. Photos of it look like the end of the world. The sky split open over and over again, lighting up clouds from within. It's not supernatural. It's just physics and weather patterns. But if you didn't know the science and you stumbled into that region at night, you'd probably assume something biblical was happening overhead. Story 3. The double slit experiment is one of those things that sounds like a classroom demo until you actually understand what it implies. You fire electrons, tiny particles, at a barrier with two narrow slits cut into it. Behind the barrier is a screen that records where they land. If electrons behaved like normal little bullets, you'd expect them to pass through one slit or the other and form two neat clusters on the screen. They don't. Instead, they create an interference pattern, the same pattern you'd get if you were firing waves through the slits, like ripples overlapping in water. Bright and dark bands, as if each electron somehow went through both slits at once and interfered with itself. Okay, weird, but maybe electrons are secretly waves. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. If you place a detector at the slits to observe which path the electron takes, the interference pattern disappears. Suddenly, they behave like particles again. Just two clusters. Clean. Predictable. So the act of measuring changes the outcome. It's not that electrons are confused, it's that at the quantum level, reality doesn't settle into a definite state until it's observed. Particles exist as probabilities, a kind of smeared out potential, until interaction forces a result. That's not sci-fi, that's experimentally verified physics. At the most fundamental level, the universe isn't solid and stable. It's weird. Story 4. When we send uncrewed space probes to other planets, they often do a close flyby of Earth or another planet first, using the acceleration from the planet's gravity to pick up speed they need to get where they're going. This is a tried and true method that's been used successfully for decades. However, sometimes when a spacecraft does a gravity assist flyby of Earth, it seems to pick up a little bit more extra speed than expected. The difference is always very tiny, not enough to adversely affect the mission, but seemingly enough to be outside the bounds of measurement error. This has happened several times since it was first observed with the Galileo spacecraft in 1990. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, but no obvious pattern has emerged. The set of people who would find this interesting may be a bit narrow, but I find it fascinating partly because of the wide variety of possible explanations that have been investigated, none of which really adequately explain all of it. Story 5. Dog Drop Pit in Citrus County, Florida is one of those local creepypasta meets urban mystery spots that Reddit keeps feeding into. And it's weird because it exists somewhere between real geography and online embellishment. So here's what people actually talk about. There's an old sinkhole or pit in Citrus County that locals have nicknamed the Dog Drop Pit, sometimes Dog Drop Hole. The basic claim is simple. Animals, mostly dogs, wander up to it and disappear. Not fall in accidentally, but just vanish. There's no official record of mass disappearances, no police documentation of dozens of missing pets in that exact spot, and no scientific report about strange forces at work. What does exist is a mix of factors that make the legend sticky. Citrus County is full of karst terrain, limestone that dissolves over time, so sinkholes and pits are real. Florida has a lot of feral dogs and abandoned animals, and if one goes missing near a deep, overgrown hole, the story spreads. People love to attach eerie meaning to things that are basically just poorly documented, naturally occurring holes in the ground. Then Reddit and other forums take it further. The dogs go in and never come out, something lives down there, local hunters won't go near it, etc. It's the kind of thing that thrives on lack of information. You can't find an official explanation, so speculation fills the vacuum. So here's the Reddit twist. There are no verified reports that every dog that goes near dog drop pit disappears forever. No police or wildlife authority has confirmed supernatural activity, and the weirdness mostly comes from stories passed around online rather than documented evidence. In other words, the pit itself is real as a geological feature, but the mysterious disappearances are almost certainly folklore amplified by the internet. It's a fun example of how places with little history become blank canvases for weird speculation. Not because something objectively anomalous is happening, but because mysterious unknowns are fertile ground for storytelling. Story 6. This is one of those stories that hits you right in the timeline glitch part of your brain. Every few years, you'll see a claim pop up. Someone cracks open a lump of coal and finds something manufactured inside it. A small brass bell, a chain, a metal tool, something clearly human-made. And the immediate reaction is, wait, coal is millions of years old? How is that even possible? That's where the creep factor comes from. Coal forms from ancient plant matter buried and compressed over geological time. We're talking Carboniferous swamps, prehistoric ecosystems. So the idea that a decorative brass bell could be sealed inside it feels like either time travel or a serious rewrite of history. But here's the less cinematic explanation. Coal seams are ancient. The chunks mined from them are not necessarily sealed in pristine isolation for 300 million years. Mining fractures seams. Water seeps in. Cracks form. Coal is relatively soft and brittle. It can split along natural planes and later re-cement with mineral deposits. Objects can get embedded in fissures or voids and later appear inside the coal rather than just attached to it. Also, a lot of these stories don't come with controlled documentation. No geological survey on site. No lab analysis of whether the object was truly encased during formation versus lodged in a crack. It feels freaky because coal equals deep time, but most likely it's a mix of mining conditions, fractures, and a good story spreading faster than careful geology. Story 7. Ball lightning is one of those things that sounds like pure folklore until you realize serious physicists have spent decades trying to explain it. For a long time, reports were brushed off as exaggerations. People described glowing orbs drifting through rooms during thunderstorms, floating across fields, squeezing through windows, hovering silently, and then vanishing. It sounded like ghost stories dressed up as weather, but the accounts are weirdly consistent. Glowing spheres, usually the size of a baseball or grapefruit, colors ranging from white to orange to blue. They move slowly, sometimes against the wind, sometimes they last a few seconds, sometimes longer, sometimes they explode, sometimes they just wink out. You saying you saw one as a kid? That's the thing. A lot of sightings come from regular people with no reason to fabricate something that makes them sound unhinged. The physics community hasn't settled on a single explanation. Some theories involve plasma trapped in magnetic fields. Others suggest vaporized silicon from lightning strikes forming glowing chemical reactions. There are microwave cavity hypotheses, ionized air models, combustion chemistry models. None of them fully explain every reported behavior. What makes it unsettling is that lightning itself is already chaotic and extreme, and ball lightning seems like lightning deciding to break the usual rules. For years, it was treated like a hoax because it didn't fit existing models. Now it's treated like a real phenomenon without a clean explanation, which, somehow, is even weirder. Story 8. Neuroscientist here. I spend most of my life buried in brain scans, neural pathways, and research papers. I take the whole the brain is everything concept pretty seriously. And then I remember there was a guy walking around with almost no brain. I'm not exaggerating. Roughly 90% of it was gone. Not damaged, not shrunk, just basically missing. His skull was mostly filled with cerebrospinal fluid. On scans, it looked like a thin rim of brain tissue hugging the inside of his head. The wild part? He had an advanced math degree, normal job, functional life, slightly below average IQ, sure, but nowhere near what you'd expect from someone who, by all logic, should barely be able to function. Every time I think I have a solid grasp on how cognition works, cases like that come back to haunt me. We map regions for language, memory, motor control. We teach students that certain areas are critical. Damage this, lose that. And then there's this guy casually existing with a brain that looks like it forgot to load properly. Neuroplasticity is powerful. But that powerful? It kind of forces you to admit we still don't fully understand what's going on in our own heads. As someone who studies the brain for a living, that's both humbling and deeply unsettling. Story 9. Dark matter and dark energy. We literally named them after the fact that we have no idea what they are. That's not even me being dramatic. That's basically the definition. Dark just means we can't see it and we don't understand it. And somehow that makes up like 95% of the entire universe? Let that sink in. Everything we've ever observed, stars, planets, galaxies, black holes, you, me, this screen, is like 5% of what's actually out there. The rest is just something. Something with gravity. Something is pushing the universe apart faster and faster. And our official explanation is essentially, yeah, there's this invisible stuff everywhere. We can't detect it directly, we don't know what it's made of, but it's definitely there. Trust us. I genuinely do. But it's wild that modern cosmology basically boils down to most of reality is made of mystery. It's kind of comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because it means there's so much left to discover. Terrifying because we might be ants confidently mapping 5% of the backyard. Story 10, consciousness. Not black holes, not quantum mechanics, not dark matter. Just the fact that you're aware right now. I've read the neuroscience take, the philosophy takes, the its emergent complexity arguments, the its integrated information theories, the its just neurons firing explanations. And none of them actually explain why there's something it feels like to be you. Like, I understand how we can map brain activity. I understand that certain regions correlate with perception, memory, decision making. Cool. But how does electrical activity turn into the experience of red, or pain, or nostalgia, or the weird internal voice reading this sentence? You can explain behavior, you can explain reaction times, you can explain neural pathways, but you can't fully explain why there's an inner movie playing at all. Why isn't the body just running on autopilot, like a biological machine with no internal experience? Why is there this private first-person perspective attached to it? And the really unsettling part, there's no way to step outside of it. You can't observe consciousness without using consciousness. It's the one thing we're trapped inside while trying to analyze it. Every other anomaly feels like a puzzle. Consciousness feels like the fact that there's a puzzle at all. Story 11. The fact that time only moves forward. I know that sounds basic, but really think about it. All the fundamental laws of physics mostly work the same whether time moves forward or backward. On the microscopic level, equations don't really care which direction time is flowing. Flip it, and a lot of it still makes sense mathematically. But in real life, everything moves one way. You remember the past, never the future. Eggs break, but they don't unbreak. Smoke spreads out, but it never casually gathers itself back into a cigarette. There's this clear arrow pointing from was to is to will be, and we just accept. And the explanation we have is entropy. Disorder increases. That's why time has a direction. But that doesn't really explain why the universe started in such a ridiculously low entropy state to begin with. That's the part that feels like the real anomaly. Why did everything start so ordered that it could spend billions of years falling apart in a smooth, predictable way? It's like walking into a room where a shattered glass is on the floor and someone says, "Don't worry, this makes sense because things break." Okay, sure, but why was the glass perfectly intact in the first place? Time feels normal because we've never experienced anything else. But when you zoom out, the fact that reality has a built-in direction that we can't reverse, step outside of, or even properly explain is honestly kind of disturbing. It's one of those things that stops feeling ordinary the longer you sit with it. Story 12. This happened in the mid-90s, and I still think about it sometimes. It was around 2 in the morning. I was driving alone, a totally empty road, one of those quiet nights where it feels like the whole world is asleep except you. No traffic, no distractions, just headlights and darkness. That's when I noticed something at the very top edge of my windshield. At first I thought it was just a star coming into view as the road dipped, but it wasn't stationary. It was moving, and fast. Way faster than any plane I've ever seen. It looked disc-shaped, not blinking like an aircraft, not leaving a trail, just a solid shape at a really high altitude, cutting across the sky in a straight line. Because there were no cars around, I had a few seconds where I could actually focus on it. From the moment it entered my field of view to the moment it disappeared completely, it couldn't have been more than 5 seconds. That was it. No dramatic hovering, no sudden turns, no beams of light, just there, then gone. I've replayed it in my head a lot over the years. Maybe it was some kind of military aircraft, maybe a meteor that looked flatter than usual. Maybe my depth perception was off and it wasn't as high as I thought. But I know what I saw, and I know how fast it moved. What sticks with me isn't even that it looked like a classic disc. It's how out of place it felt. The sky is usually predictable. Planes blink. Satellites crawl. Meteors streak and burn. This thing just crossed the sky like it had somewhere important to be. And then it was gone. I'm not saying it was aliens. I'm just saying I've never seen anything like it before or since. Story 13. I had my first ghost encounter in NOLA during Mardi Gras. Me and a friend, we're from California, decided on a last-minute trip to NOLA to check out the festivities. We get there and get super drunk and end up getting separated. I had to walk a pretty far distance to get back to our hotel. To save time, I cut through a neighborhood. In order to get to the other side, I had to cross the railroad tracks near a small creek. Nearby, there was an old bench. When I started to walk in the dark to cross the railroad tracks, I just felt the sudden urge that something was behind me. I bolted down the tracks as carefully and fast as I could. Bam, I made it. While I'm gasping for air, I hear what sounds like an old man groaning. I turn around and on the bench, a shadow figure with red eyes was sitting on that fucking bench. The eyes were red, but the pupils were black. When I made it into the parking lot, there was a local sitting by their car smoking. I went over to him, had a smoke, and told him what happened. He told me I must have ran into something called a haint. I've never heard of it, but apparently it's something like a bad spirit of some sort. The guy told me I should have been at the festivities, and they usually mess with people who aren't out partying. Story 14. The creepiest anomaly to me isn't something in space. It's the fact that there are documented cases of people dying and then being found miles away from where it would make any sense for them to be. I'm talking about experienced hikers who vanish on familiar trails. Search teams comb the area for days, sometimes weeks, and then the body turns up in a location that was supposedly already searched, or in a spot that would have required climbing terrain that makes no sense for their physical condition. Sometimes shoes are neatly removed, sometimes clothes are folded, sometimes there are no clear signs of struggle, no obvious cause that explains the behavior, and before anyone says it, yes, exposure and hypothermia can cause paradoxical undressing and confusion. People get disoriented, they wander, but that explanation doesn't always cleanly cover the logistics. How someone ends up uphill when hypothermia victims usually seek shelter downhill. How search dogs miss scent in contained areas. How remains appear in places that were supposedly cleared multiple times. It's not one case, it's a pattern of cases that just feel off. There's usually a rational explanation somewhere in the mix. Weather, terrain, human error in search grids, memory distortions, but every once in a while you read one and it lingers. Not because it proves something paranormal, but because it exposes how fragile we are in the wilderness, how quickly a person can just slip out of the world's awareness, how easy it is for something to go wrong in a way that leaves almost no clean narrative behind. Story 15. One of the strangest anomalies to me is the fact that the vacuum of space isn't actually empty. It sounds simple, but it's not. If you remove all particles, all radiation, all matter from a region of space, you'd think you'd be left with true nothing. Just a blank stage. Except you're not. According to quantum field theory, even empty space is boiling with activity. Virtual particles pop into existence and disappear almost instantly. Energy fluctuations happen constantly. The vacuum has immeasurable energy to it. There's even experimental evidence for it, like the Casimir effect, where two metal plates placed extremely close together in a vacuum will subtly move toward each other because of quantum fluctuations between them. So the emptiest thing possible still isn't empty. And it gets weirder. That vacuum energy might be tied to the expansion of the universe itself. The same nothing between galaxies could be what's pushing everything apart faster and faster, which means the background state of reality isn't stillness, it's chaos. The idea that nothingness is actually unstable, restless, and full of invisible activity kind of breaks your intuition. We evolved to understand rocks, trees, and gravity, not the idea that the baseline of existence is a fluctuating quantum storm. The creepiest part is that this isn't fringe theory. This is mainstream physics. The universe isn't built on something, it's built on something that looks a lot like nothing. Story 16. The weirdest anomaly to me isn't something in space. It's how often governments openly admit to running massive secret programs decades after the fact, and everyone just shrugs. We've had confirmed mind control experiments, confirmed radiation exposure tests on civilians, confirmed surveillance programs that ran way longer and way deeper than anyone suspected at the time. Stuff that sounded insane when people first talked about it. And then years later, it's like, yeah, that happened. No collapse of society, just a declassified document dump and a couple news cycles. That pattern is the part that feels off, because it creates this strange gray zone where the line between paranoia and patience gets blurry. Some theories are obviously nonsense, but some things that were once labeled crazy turned out to be partially or entirely true. So now you're left with this uncomfortable question in the back of your mind. What's currently being dismissed that will quietly be confirmed 30 years from now? I'm not saying there's some shadow council running the planet. I'm just saying history has shown that large-scale secrets can exist in plain sight while most people go about their lives completely unaware. And that's a little unsettling, not because it proves that that would never happen is not a reliable argument. Story 17, the South Atlantic Anomaly. It sounds like the name of a low-budget sci-fi movie, but it's very real. There's this region over the South Atlantic where Earth's magnetic field is significantly weaker than everywhere else. Satellites that pass through it sometimes glitch. Instruments shut down. The International Space Station has to power down certain systems when crossing it because the radiation levels spike. It's basically a dent in our planet's magnetic shield. The official explanation is that Earth's magnetic field isn't perfectly centered, and the molten iron in the core flows in weird, complex patterns. Totally plausible. The planet is messy under the hood, but here's the part that feels strange. The anomaly has been growing and drifting and slowly weakening over time. NASA tracks space agencies plan around it. It's not hidden, it's just quietly acknowledged as one of those things. And if you zoom out, Earth's magnetic field has flipped before. Many times, north becomes south, south becomes north. The geological record shows it's happened repeatedly. So we're living on a planet where the invisible force field protecting us from solar radiation can weaken, wander, and eventually flip entirely, and we're just kind of riding it out. I'm not saying it's a doomsday switch, but there's something eerie about the fact that above a certain stretch of ocean, space radiation dips closer to Earth than it should. Like the shield has a thin spot. Story 18. Oumuamua still bothers me. Not in a "it's definitely aliens" way, just in a "why is this so weird" way. Back in 2017, astronomers spotted this object flying through our solar system. First confirmed interstellar object ever observed passing through. That alone is cool. But then the details started stacking up. It was shaped like nothing we'd really seen before. Long. Extremely elongated. Some estimates made it look cigar-shaped, others more like a pancake. Either way, it wasn't your typical space rock. It accelerated slightly as it left the solar system. That's the part that really threw people off. Normally, objects speed up or slow down because of gravity, but Oumuamua had this tiny extra push. The standard explanation was outgassing, like a comet releasing vapor that acts like a thruster, except no visible coma, no clear tail, no typical comet behavior. So scientists had to propose it might be a weird type of hydrogen iceberg, or nitrogen ice, or something fragile and exotic that we've never actually seen before but theoretically could exist. And then one prominent Harvard astrophysicist publicly suggested it could be artificial. Not definitely, just not ruled out. That's when things got loud. Most of the scientific community leaned hard into natural explanations, which makes sense. You don't jump to aliens. But the fact that the data left even a tiny crack in the door is what made it feel different. Story 19. The Fermi bubbles sound fake, like something you'd unlock in a space strategy game. But they're real. Two absolutely massive lobes of high-energy radiation extending above and below the center of our galaxy. They stretch something like 25,000 light-years in each direction. That's not a typo. They're bigger than we can intuitively process. We didn't even notice them until 2010, when data from the Fermi Gamma-Ray Space Telescope revealed these enormous symmetrical structures blasting out of the Milky Way's core in gamma rays. Picture our galaxy, spiral arms, billions of stars. Now picture two giant glowing balloons coming out of the middle, like something exhaled by a cosmic dragon. The leading explanation is that our supermassive black hole had a violent feeding event a few million years ago. It swallowed a bunch of material, got loud about it, and burped out energy in opposite directions. Totally plausible. But here's the unsettling part. It means the calm, starry sky we look at every night is attached to a galaxy that, relatively recently, had an explosive episode powerful enough to inflate structures tens of thousands of light years tall. And we only figured it out because we finally looked at the sky in gamma rays. How many other giant features are just sitting there, invisible to us until we build the right instrument? The Fermi bubbles aren't aliens. They're not a weapon. They're just a reminder that the Milky Way isn't some peaceful spiral backdrop. It's active, violent, capable of galaxy-scale outbursts, and we're orbiting right in the middle of it, pretending space is quiet. Story 20, there's a region near Africa where gravity is weaker. Not sci-fi, you won't float away, but satellites measure it. Instruments confirm it. The pull of Earth isn't perfectly uniform, and over parts of Africa and the South Atlantic it dips. They call it a gravity anomaly, which sounds harmless until you realize what it implies. Underneath Africa, deep in the mantle, there's this enormous structure, something like a continent-sized blob of dense material sitting thousands of kilometers below the surface. Seismic waves move through it differently. It's hotter. It's chemically distinct. It shouldn't really be there in the way it is. One leading idea is that it's ancient oceanic crust that got subducted and pulled down there over hundreds of millions of years. Another is that it's a primordial structure left over from when the planet first formed. Either way, it's massive, and it's affecting gravity measurements from space. So when satellites pass over certain parts of the African continent and the South Atlantic, they slightly dip because the mass distribution inside Earth isn't evenly spread. The planet isn't a smooth, uniform sphere. It's lumpy, uneven, weird under the surface. What makes it feel conspiracy-coded is that this same general region overlaps with the South Atlantic anomaly, where Earth's magnetic field is weaker and radiation dips closer to the planet. Gravity anomaly, magnetic anomaly, same broad neighborhood, totally explainable through geophysics, mantle convection, and core dynamics. But it still feels strange knowing there's a continent-sized, ancient structure deep under Africa quietly warping gravity and possibly influencing Earth's magnetic behavior. Story 21. Blood Falls is one of those things that genuinely looks staged. You've got this massive white glacier in Antarctica, in one of the driest and coldest places on Earth, and out of it pours a stream of deep red liquid. Not slightly tinted, not kind of pink. It literally looks like the ice is bleeding. When early explorers first saw it, they were understandably confused. In a landscape that already feels like another planet, this bright red waterfall just made everything feel even more wrong. The explanation is actually chemical, not horror movie material. Beneath Taylor Glacier, there's a pocket of ancient salt water that's been trapped for millions of years. That water is loaded with iron. When it slowly seeps through cracks in the ice and finally reaches the surface, the iron reacts with oxygen in the air. It oxidizes, basically the same way metal rusts. That reaction is what turns the water that dark blood red color. What makes it more than just a cool geology fact is what's living in that trapped water. Scientists have found microbes surviving down there, cut off from sunlight and fresh oxygen, feeding off chemical reactions between iron and sulfur. They're basically running on chemistry instead of photosynthesis. So you end up with this glacier that looks like it's hemorrhaging, and underneath it is an isolated ecosystem that's been sealed away for an absurd amount of time. Story 22. The Immortal Jellyfish. Sounds like clickbait. It isn't. There's an actual species of jellyfish that can basically hit the biological reset button on itself. When most animals get injured, stressed, or old, that's it. Cells degrade, systems fail. The process moves in one direction. But this thing can revert its mature cells back to an earlier developmental stage. Instead of dying, it transforms back into its juvenile polyp form and starts its life cycle over again. It doesn't just heal, it rewinds. Imagine being an adult human and, when things start going downhill, you somehow revert back into infancy with all your cells freshly reprogrammed. That's essentially what this jellyfish pulls off. At a cellular level, scientists call the process transdifferentiation. It's real, documented biology. Under the right conditions, the adult medusa doesn't die in the usual sense. It collapses back into a blob of tissue, reorganizes, and regrows into a younger version of itself. In theory, that means it can bypass death from aging entirely. It can still be eaten, it can still get destroyed. It's not invincible, but biologically speaking, it doesn't have to age into death the way most organisms do. That's the part that feels like an anomaly. Every complex life form we're familiar with follows the same rule: grow, reproduce, decline, die. It's baked into the system, except this tiny, almost transparent jellyfish floating around in the ocean just quietly ignores that rule. Story 23. Kangaroos can literally pause pregnancy, not in a delayed cycle way. I mean, they can actually put an embryo on hold like it's a draft email. Female kangaroos have this thing called embryonic diapause. If environmental conditions are bad, like there isn't enough food, or they're already nursing a joey, the embryo just stops developing. It stays in this suspended state, barely progressing, waiting for the green light. Then, when conditions improve, development resumes like nothing happened. No dramatic restart, no new conception needed, just unpause and continue. What makes it even stranger is that a female kangaroo can basically juggle multiple stages of offspring at once. She can have a joey outside the pouch, a younger one inside the pouch, and an embryo in suspended animation all at the same time. It feels like biology running a queue system. Most mammals don't get that option. Once pregnancy starts, it moves forward whether it's convenient or not. Evolution locked in a pretty rigid timeline for us. But kangaroos evolved in Australia, where the environment can flip from abundant to brutal fast. So instead of gambling on perfect timing, they built in a biological contingency plan. If drought hits, pause. If resources come back, resume. It's not flashy, it's not sci-fi, but it is a mammal casually overriding what most of us think of as a fixed, unstoppable biological clock, which makes you realize that even something as fundamental as pregnancy isn't as rigid as we assume. Story 24. The Door to Hell sounds like something made up for a fantasy novel. It's not. In the middle of the Karakum Desert in Turkmenistan, there's a massive crater that has been on fire since 1971. It wasn't intentional in the dramatic sense. Soviet geologists were drilling for natural gas. The ground collapsed, and it opened up into this huge pit leaking methane. They figured the safest thing to do was set it on fire so the gas would burn off. They assumed it would take a few days. That was over 50 years ago. It's still burning. At night, the whole crater glows bright orange. Flames flicker across the bottom like a living thing breathing. The heat rolling off it is intense enough that you can feel it from a distance. There's no machinery keeping it going. No one is feeding it fuel. It's just continuously burning natural gas that's been seeping out of the earth for decades. What makes it feel surreal isn't just the fire. It's the idea that humans accidentally created a permanent-looking wound in the ground and then just left it. It's not supernatural, it's not a portal, it's a geological accident fueled by a resource we were trying to extract. But there's something eerie about the fact that a decision made in the early 70s is still physically burning today. Generations have come and gone, governments have changed, technology has evolved, and that crater is still out there in the desert on fire every single night. Ori 25. The eye of the Sahara genuinely looks artificial, like someone carved a giant target into the earth. It's this massive circular formation in Mauritania, about 28 miles across, made up of concentric rings that are so perfectly visible from space that astronauts actually use it as a landmark. In a desert that's mostly just endless sand and rock, this thing stands out like a fingerprint. For a long time, people thought it might be an impact crater. It looks exactly like what you'd expect from something enormous slamming into the planet. But there's no clear evidence of a meteor strike. The current explanation is that it's a deeply eroded geological dome. Layers of rock were pushed upward millions of years ago, then wind and erosion slowly peeled them back, exposing the rings like layers of an onion. Which makes sense, but it still feels strange that natural processes produced something so symmetrical and so visible from orbit. Most geology looks messy and chaotic. This looks intentional. It's not some hidden alien structure. It's not Atlantis. It's just the Earth doing what the Earth does over absurd timescales. Still, there's something about seeing a perfectly circular bullseye in the middle of the Sahara that makes your brain hesitate for a second. Because on a planet covered in irregular coastlines, jagged mountains, and chaotic terrain, this one spot looks like it was designed to be noticed. And if you're in space looking down at Earth, it's staring right back at you. Story 26. Brinicles are one of those things that sound made up until you see the footage. They're basically underwater icicles that grow downward from sea ice in polar oceans. Scientists sometimes call them brinicles, but the nickname is way more dramatic. Ice fingers of death. Here's what happens. When sea ice forms, it pushes salt out of the ice crystals. That creates super cold, extremely salty brine that's denser than the surrounding seawater. Eventually, that freezing brine starts draining downward in a thin stream. As it sinks, it's so cold that it freezes the seawater around it, forming a hollow tube of ice that keeps extending toward the ocean floor. It looks like a slow-motion stalactite growing in reverse. The creepy part is what happens when it reaches the seabed. Anything slow-moving in its path, like starfish or sea urchins, can get frozen in place. The brinicle spreads across the bottom in branching patterns, encasing whatever it touches in ice. There's no explosion, no sudden violence. It just slowly descends and freezes life where it finds it. It feels like something from another planet. A silent underwater ice spike forming in total darkness, crawling along the seafloor and turning living creatures into statues. But it's just physics: salt, temperature, density. Still, if you showed someone that footage without context, it would look like the ocean itself was deploying a weapon. And the fact that this happens naturally, quietly, under polar ice sheets, is what makes it such a perfect anomaly. Story 27. The Great Unconformity is basically a missing chapter in Earth's history, and not a small one. We're talking about a gap in the rock record where, in some places, over 1 billion years are just gone. You can stand at the Grand Canyon, look at the layers in the cliff face, and literally put your hand on the boundary. Below it, ancient rocks that formed more than 1 billion years ago. Above it, much younger layers. In between, an absurd amount of time that simply isn't there. It's like opening a history book and finding that someone ripped out a third of the pages. Geologists call it an unconformity, which is a very calm word for something that represents an almost incomprehensible stretch of missing time. The leading explanation is massive erosion. Ancient mountain ranges rose and were worn down, glaciers scraped continents clean. Entire layers of rock were stripped away before new sediments were deposited on top. Totally natural processes, but the scale of it is what feels unreal. 1 billion years is longer than complex life has existed. It's longer than the gap between dinosaurs and us. It's so far beyond human timescales that your brain kind of shuts off trying to process it. And yet, physically, it's just a line in the rock. What makes it feel like an anomaly isn't that it's mysterious in a supernatural way. It's that Earth can delete that much of its own record and keep going like nothing happened. Story 28. The dancing plague of 1518 sounds like satire. It wasn't. In the summer of 1518, in Strasbourg, a woman reportedly started dancing in the street. Not celebrating, not performing, just dancing, for hours. Then days, and she didn't stop. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her. Within a month, there were hundreds. They danced in the streets in the middle of summer heat, collapsing from exhaustion, only to get back up and keep moving. Some reportedly died from strokes or heart failure. The authorities at the time genuinely didn't know what to do. Their solution was to hire musicians and clear space so the dancers could dance it out, because they believed the only cure was more dancing. which in hindsight is probably the worst possible response. There are theories: ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, which can cause hallucinations and convulsions; mass psychogenic illness triggered by extreme stress and hardship; religious fervor spiraling out of control in a population already strained by famine and disease. All plausible, but none of them feel fully satisfying, because even if you accept mass hysteria, you still have to process the image of hundreds of people physically unable to stop dancing for weeks. Not as a festival, not as a ritual, but as something that looked more like a compulsion hijacking their bodies. It wasn't one person having a breakdown. It was a city. And then, just as strangely as it began, it faded. No permanent dancing cult. No repeat events on that scale in Strasbourg. Just a historical spike where, for one summer, reality seemed to glitch and an entire crowd moved as if controlled by something invisible. Story 29. Wow. Signal is one of those stories that sounds exaggerated until you realize how simple it actually was. In 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio picked up a strong, narrowband radio signal coming from the direction of Sagittarius. It lasted 72 seconds, which was exactly as long as the telescope could observe that particular patch of sky. As the Earth rotated, then it was gone. When the astronomer reviewing the data saw how unusually strong the signal was, he circled the printout and wrote, "Wow," in the margin. That's the official name now. What made it so strange wasn't just that it was powerful. It was narrowband, meaning it was concentrated in a very specific frequency range. Natural cosmic sources usually spread their emissions across a wider spectrum. Narrowband signals are exactly the kind of thing humans produce intentionally for communication. So immediately, people noticed. The signal appeared to come from deep space, roughly in the direction of Sagittarius. It matched what scientists had long suggested would be a logical frequency for interstellar communication. And then every attempt to detect it again failed. They pointed the telescope back at the same coordinates. Nothing. Other observatories listened. Nothing. Decades of scanning the sky since then, and that exact signal has never repeated. There are proposed explanations. Maybe it was a rare astrophysical phenomenon, maybe a comet reflecting radio waves, maybe something terrestrial that slipped through. But none of those explanations have completely closed the case. It's probably not aliens. Still, there's something deeply unsettling about the fact that, for 72 seconds, we might have intercepted something intentional, something artificial, and then missed our only chance to hear it again. Story 30. The Hessdalen lights are one of those phenomena that refuse to go away. Since at least the 1930s, people in a small Norwegian valley called Hessdalen have reported glowing orbs appearing in the sky. Not quick flashes like lightning, not distant aircraft. Actual balls of light that hover, drift, and sometimes shoot across the valley at high speed. What makes it harder to dismiss is that this isn't just random eyewitness accounts from one dramatic night. The sightings spiked in the early 1980s to the point where there were dozens of reports a week. Scientists eventually set up monitoring stations with cameras and instruments. They've recorded some of the lights on radar. They've captured photos. They've taken measurements. So this isn't just folklore. The lights vary in color, often white or yellow, sometimes red. Some stay still for minutes. Others move in sharp, sudden motions that don't look like normal aircraft patterns. A few have been described as splitting into multiple lights or changing shape. There are scientific theories, of course. Plasma caused by ionized gas in the atmosphere. Combustion of dust containing scandium in the valley. Piezoelectric effects from the local geology. Basically rare natural light phenomena triggered by unique environmental conditions. All plausible. But here's the weird part. Even after decades of study, there isn't one clean, universally accepted explanation that neatly wraps it up. The lights still appear occasionally, researchers still monitor the valley, and every time a new video surfaces, it restarts the debate. It's probably some rare atmospheric or geological effect. Still, the idea that a quiet valley in Norway has had glowing orbs casually drifting around it for nearly a century is hard not to find unsettling. Story 31. The Oklo natural nuclear reactor sounds like something that should not exist. But it does. In the 1970s, scientists analyzing uranium from a mine in Gabon noticed something strange. The ratio of certain uranium isotopes was off. Specifically, there was less uranium-235 than there should have been naturally. At first, that's the kind of discrepancy that makes people nervous, because uranium-235 is the isotope that gets used in nuclear reactors. After digging into it, researchers realized something wild. Nearly 2 billion years ago, the uranium deposits at Oklo reached the exact conditions needed for sustained nuclear fission. Groundwater seeped into the rock, slowed down neutrons, and effectively acted like a moderator, just like in a modern nuclear reactor. The reactions would heat up, boil away the water, shut themselves down, cool off, and then start again when water returned. It cycled like that for hundreds of thousands of years. No engineers, no containment dome, no civilization. just geology and physics lining up perfectly. The reason it doesn't happen today is because uranium-235 has decayed over time. 2 billion years ago, there was enough of it naturally present in the ore to make the chain reactions possible. Today, there isn't. What makes it feel like an anomaly isn't just that fission happened naturally. It's that the planet basically built and ran its own nuclear reactor long before humans ever figured out how. We tend to think of nuclear energy as this deeply modern, almost forbidden technology, something that represents advanced civilization. Meanwhile, Earth casually did it first, and it did it without melting down the planet. It's not paranormal, it's not conspiracy fuel, but it is a reminder that sometimes the line between impossible and inevitable under the right conditions is thinner than we think. Story 32. The fairy circles of Namibia look like crop circles made by a perfectionist with infinite patience, except they weren't made overnight. There are millions of them scattered across parts of the Namib Desert, perfectly round patches of bare soil, each surrounded by a ring of grass. From above, they form this eerie honeycomb pattern that stretches for miles. They're not random. They're spaced out with almost mathematical precision. For years, nobody could agree on what was causing them. Some locals had folklore explanations, spirits, dragons breathing underground, the usual desert mythology. Scientists, of course, had more grounded ideas. One theory says termites are responsible. The insects clear vegetation and alter the soil structure in a way that creates and maintains the circles. Another theory argues it's self-organizing vegetation patterns. In extremely dry environments, plants compete for water in a way that naturally creates evenly spaced gaps. Both explanations have supporting evidence. Both explanations have weaknesses. What makes it feel like an anomaly isn't that we have zero clues. It's that something on such a massive scale, so visually striking, can still spark serious debate. You'd think millions of identical circles would leave a straightforward trail of evidence. Instead, researchers are still arguing over whether it's insects, plant competition, or a combination of both. Story 33. The Siberian salamander feels like it's cheating. Most animals freeze, and that's the end of the story. Ice crystals shred cells. Organs fail. Game over. But this thing lives in Siberia, where winter temperatures can drop to levels that make your lungs hurt just thinking about them. Instead of migrating or burrowing deep enough to avoid freezing, it just freezes. Its body temperature drops below zero. Ice forms in and around its tissues. Its heart stops, breathing stops. Metabolism basically flatlines. By every normal definition, it's dead. Except it isn't. When spring comes and the ground thaws, the salamander thaws too. Its cells kick back into gear. Its heart starts beating again. It resumes moving around like nothing dramatic just happened. There have even been reports of individuals emerging from permafrost after being frozen for extremely long periods of time. Scientists debate the exact limits, but the fact that it can survive being frozen solid at all is already wild enough. The trick is chemistry. The salamander floods its tissues with cryoprotectants like glycerol that help prevent lethal ice damage. Instead of sharp crystals ripping everything apart, the freezing process becomes controlled and survivable. It spends the winter as a biological statue. Then the ice melts, and it just walks away. In a world where freezing is usually a death sentence, this tiny amphibian treats it like a seasonal inconvenience. And that's a pretty solid anomaly. Story 34. The naked mole rat looks like evolution forgot to finish rendering it. Hairless, wrinkled, giant teeth, lives underground in pitch darkness. You'd assume it's just another weird rodent adapted to harsh conditions. Except biologically, it's kind of a freak of nature. For starters, it's remarkably resistant to cancer. Not just low rates. For a long time, scientists thought it basically didn't get cancer at all. That's almost unheard of in mammals, especially ones that live as long as naked mole rats do. And they live a long time, decades. Way longer than similar-sized rodents. Then there's the pain thing. They don't respond to certain types of pain the way other mammals do. Acid burns, for example, don't trigger the same pain signals. Researchers discovered this while studying how they survive in underground burrows filled with high levels of carbon dioxide. In most mammals, that kind of environment would cause serious irritation and pain. For them, it's just Tuesday. The more scientists study them, the more weird details show up. Their cells produce a unique form of hyaluronic acid that seems tied to their cancer resistance. Their metabolism works in low oxygen conditions that would knock other mammals out cold. They even have eusocial colonies, kind of like ants or bees, with a breeding queen. A mammal with insect-like social structure, extreme longevity, cancer resistance, and unusual pain and sensitivity. Story 35. Chimeras are one of those things that sound mythological until you realize they're completely real. Not the lion, goat, snake monster kind. I'm talking about actual humans walking around with two different sets of DNA in their bodies. It usually happens when two non-identical embryos fuse very early in development. Instead of becoming twins, they merge into a single organism. The result is one person made up of two genetically distinct cell lines, two blueprints, one body. In some cases, it's subtle. Maybe different patches of skin have slightly different pigmentation. Maybe one side of the body has a different blood type than the other. Sometimes the only reason it's discovered is because of a medical test that doesn't add up. There have been cases where a woman's DNA didn't match her own biological children during routine testing. At first glance, it looked impossible. Later, doctors realized some of her reproductive cells carried a different set of DNA than the cells sampled from her cheek or blood. Imagine finding out you were technically your own twin. Most of the time, people with chimerism never know. It doesn't come with glowing eyes or dramatic symptoms. It's just a quiet genetic twist that happened before you were even aware of existing. What makes it feel like an anomaly is how it messes with our assumptions about identity. We're used to thinking of ourselves as genetically singular. One genome, one person. Chimerism breaks that simplicity. It means a single human body can contain multiple genetic identities coexisting seamlessly. It blurs the line between individuality and multiplicity in a way that feels almost philosophical. You think you're one, biologically, you might be two. Story 36. Bilateral gynandromorphism looks like someone took an animal and drew a perfectly straight line down the middle with two different templates. On one side, it's male. On the other side, it's female. Not metaphorically, genetically. This shows up most dramatically in butterflies and birds. You'll see a butterfly where the left wing has the bright coloration typical of a male, and the right wing has the duller pattern of a female. Or a bird, like a cardinal, where one half of the body is vivid red and the other half is the softer brown usually seen in females. It's not a blend. It's a split. The reason it happens is usually an error very early in development. When the first cells divide, something goes wrong with the sex chromosomes. Instead of all cells carrying the same sex chromosomes, two distinct cell lines form and spread across the body in a left-right divide. So the animal literally develops as two sexes at once. What makes it so eerie is how clean the division can be. Sometimes the split is almost perfectly symmetrical, as if nature traced a ruler down the spine and said, this side male, that side female. It challenges how we think about biological sex being uniform across an organism. In these cases, sex isn't a single, consistent identity throughout the body. It's a mosaic. Most of these animals function normally. Some can reproduce, some can't. But visually, they look like living glitches, not mythical creatures, not hybrids in the sci-fi sense. Just a rare developmental twist that produces an organism that is in the most literal way possible, two sexes sharing one body. Story 37. The corpse flower feels like something evolution designed while in a bad mood. It's massive. When it blooms, it can tower over people, but instead of producing a sweet scent to attract bees or butterflies, it does the exact opposite. It smells like rotting flesh. Not kind of unpleasant, not earthy. People who've stood near it describe it as roadkill in summer, decaying meat, a dead animal that's been sitting too long. And it doesn't just smell like death. It warms itself up. When Amorphophallus titanum blooms, it actually generates heat through a process called thermogenesis. That warmth helps spread the odor farther, mimicking the body heat of a fresh carcass. To carrion beetles and flesh flies, it's basically a 5-star buffet invitation. They show up expecting a corpse. Instead, they get pollen. The whole strategy is deception. Most flowers advertise nectar and reward pollinators. This one pretends to be a dead body and tricks insects that specialize in decay. It also doesn't bloom often. Sometimes it takes years, even over a decade, to build up enough energy for a single bloom that lasts just a couple of days. Then, it collapses back into dormancy. So you have this enormous plant that waits years for its moment, erupts into a giant heat-producing corpse-scented structure, fills the air with the smell of death, and then disappears again. Story 38. The rainbow eucalyptus looks photoshopped, like someone took a normal tree and ran a saturation filter over the trunk just to see what would happen. Except it's real. Its bark peels away in strips throughout the year. When the fresh bark underneath is exposed, it's bright green. As it ages, it shifts through shades of blue, purple, orange, and maroon. Because different sections peel at different times, the trunk ends up looking like a vertical abstract painting. And it's not a small ornamental tree either. It can grow incredibly tall, straight, and smooth, with this surreal patchwork running all the way up. What makes it feel like an anomaly isn't just the color. It's that trees aren't supposed to look like that. Our brains categorize trunks as brown or gray, maybe textured, maybe mossy, not neon green fading into violet. There's no mystical reason behind it. The colors come from tannins and chlorophyll interacting as the bark matures and oxidizes. Totally normal plant chemistry. But the result looks anything but normal. You can walk through a tropical forest and suddenly see what looks like a living rainbow growing out of the ground. No bioluminescence, no genetic engineering, no trick lighting. Just a tree casually breaking the aesthetic rules we expect from nature. And the weirdest part is that it doesn't stand out to itself at all. It's just doing three things. We're the ones staring at it like it glitched. Story 39. Fast radio bursts are one of those space anomalies that feel like the universe is pinging us. They're insanely powerful bursts of radio waves that last only milliseconds. That's it, a blink. And in that blink, they can release as much energy as the sun emits over days. The first one was discovered by accident in archive data. For a while, people weren't even sure they were real. Maybe it was interference, maybe equipment glitching. Except then more started showing up. They come from outside our galaxy. Some repeat, some don't. Some fire once and are never heard from again. Others pulse in strange patterns. The leading explanation is that at least some of them come from magnetars, which are ultra-dense neutron stars with magnetic fields so strong they warp physics around them. When their crust shifts or cracks, they can release these ridiculous bursts of energy. Totally plausible. But here's what makes it feel eerie. For years, they were just random flashes in the dark. No warning, no follow-up, just a spike in the data and silence. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, and once in a while, you hear a sharp knock on the wall. You check, nothing. Hours later, another knock. That's what fast radio bursts feel like. Brief, distant, powerful signals from somewhere deep in the universe, most of which we still can't trace perfectly. They're probably natural, but they don't feel quiet. They feel like the cosmos clearing its throat. Story 40. Tabby's star is what happens when astronomy briefly goes, wait, what? It's a normal-looking star in our galaxy. Nothing visually dramatic about it. No giant explosions, no obvious companion star ripping material away. But when NASA's Kepler telescope monitored its brightness, the light curve made no sense. Stars naturally dim a little when planets pass in front of them. That's how we find exoplanets. The dips are small and predictable. Tabby's star was small and predictable. It dimmed by huge amounts, irregularly, not in clean, repeating intervals. Sometimes it would lose over 20% of its brightness, then slowly recover. Then it would do something different the next time. Astronomers started scrambling for explanations. Maybe a swarm of comets, maybe dust clouds, maybe debris from a shattered planet. And then someone floated the idea of a megastructure, like a partial Dyson sphere. Not as a serious conclusion, but as a possibility that couldn't immediately be ruled out because the data was that weird. That's what made it explode online. Most researchers now lean toward complex dust patterns causing the strange dimming. It's the safest explanation and fits better with what we know about astrophysics. But for a moment, the data didn't neatly fit any familiar box. And that's the anomaly. A completely ordinary-looking star that behaved in a completely non-ordinary way. It's probably dust. Still, the fact that we had to even entertain the idea of alien engineering, however briefly, says a lot about how strange its behavior really was.